Okay. So, thank you, everybody who came tonight. I'm Sean Radcliffe. I'm with the Conservation Commission. And I just wanted to briefly give you a kind of a process explanation of how we got to where we are tonight. And uh, the natural resources inventory is something that Concoms are supposed to maintain and have them tabulated or updated, I think, every 10 years, and Temple was well overdue. We were over 15 years, maybe closer to 20. So a couple of years ago, the planning board approached us, and because the natural resources inventory is part of the master plan, and they are slowly going through and updating the master plan, came to the Concom and said, hey, we'll give you some money. Here's our budget. Try to see if, what do you want to do for the NRI? Because that's what you guys do. And we pursued finding different resources, and we eventually found and came up with Moosewood Ecological and Jeff Littleton, and we're absolutely delighted with his work. So I wanted to also just point out some of I want to thank the planning board for having us do this. I think, Bruce, you're the only member of the planning board here tonight, I think, but thank you because we couldn't have done it without you guys helping and funding and all that. The other conservation members that are in the room is Scott Hecker, Kathy Jolly, Marie and Clay Leonards, you're both back there, and Mike Madden. Did I miss anybody? Oh, Eric is a emeritus member, maybe? Former member, at least. Maybe active? I don't know. Anyway, so that's really all I wanted to say. I wanted to, Jeff is continuing to do some additional work for the town because we love his work. Without further ado, I'm going to let Jeff explain what he's done in the document for Temple. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you all for being here this evening, and for those that are joining remotely, welcome as well. So my name is Jeff Littleton. I'm the principal ecologist at Moosewood Ecological. We're based out of the Monadnock region here. Our main office is in Chesterfield, but we have staff that's sort of scattered throughout New Hampshire between Hancock and Marlow and Keene and north of Concord and Salisbury as well. For over 20 years, we've been helping communities with conservation planning, land management and stewardship, habitat restoration, enhancement and creation, along many other ecological services that we provide. And one of the most favorite projects we work on are natural resource inventories, and that's what we're here to talk about this evening. We've worked in over 25% of New Hampshire communities over the past 22 years, so we're very lucky. And we're very fortunate to work in communities such as Temple, where there's a lot of interest in the natural resources. I'm finding this to be true all throughout New Hampshire. We all love the great outdoors here. And so what I hope to do this evening is provide you with a very brief glimpse of the natural resources here in Temple. You know an awful lot from your journeys, from walking around and fishing and hunting and what have you, from living here, maybe growing up here, maybe you just moved to the area and learning more about it. But this natural resource inventory is a community resource. We'll talk about a variety aspects of it throughout the evening here. And I'm going to take about 30 to 40 minutes to briefly go over this. Feel free to ask questions at any point if you like, or feel free to wait towards the end. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, can everybody hear me okay? Hi, welcome. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is give you a background of natural resource inventory. Basically, what are they? Sean started to introduce why your community has undergone a revision of your natural resource inventory, the reasons why we conduct them, and then we're going to get into the specific components here in Temple. because this has been a 2-year process, us working on this natural resources inventory, or NRI, as I'll call it from here on out. The first year we were working on mapping, more sort of office work, developing the maps and a draft report. And then last year we were able to get out on the ground to do some biodiversity assessments. So tonight will be a culmination of all of this information up to this point. As Sean pointed out, it is up to you, the community, and since the community has a conservation commission, it does fall on your shoulders to periodically produce a natural resource inventory, or as the state of New Hampshire says in RSA 36A2, you shall conduct these searches and researches into your natural resources and create an index. Over the past, I don't know, 50 to 60 years, it's been commonly referred to as the Natural Resource Inventory, or your NRI. So the state says you must do this as a community and use this to help with your townwide planning. And it does, and it is part of your master plan, along with future land use and a variety of other sections in your master plan, which Sean also noted there's several chapters that are being updated currently. State says you have to do it, but they don't give you any funding. Such is life. So why do we conduct these natural resource inventory? You'll see some common themes this evening, but it's one of the big pieces is to help to promote informed decision-making centered around your land use in your community. Where are your sensitive natural resources located throughout your community? How might you look to protect them, and why are they important? Is the information that you'll be able to glean from your natural resource inventory. So it's an education document as well. It really does contribute to your cultural and economic community structure here. We all center around our natural resources. We love going outside. We love the great outdoors. You've probably seen bears around lately. They might have been to your bird feeders. We did leave ours up a little long, and lo and behold, one of our bird feeders was in the yard. That was the first time that's happened, but I heard it happen to somebody else in here this evening as well. And then also another big piece, it forms that first phase of a conservation plan or an open space plan, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. How do we use it? I mentioned some of these: public education, education, education. I can't stress that enough of how important this document is, not for you as residents here in the community, but maybe some of you serve on boards such as the planning board or the select board, the conservation commission. So this is a big tool for you to integrate into your overall land use planning. The master plan here, mentioning that's natural resources inventory is typically a section in your master plan to help bring to light where these resources are and why are they important. Stewardship planning. That's a big key piece of the use of a natural resource inventory, because you, as a township, you own some lands here in town, and particularly a really significant town forest. It also helps to prioritize more detailed studies as we learn more about the landscape, or really start to dig into it through our office investigations, using existing information to develop a variety of maps, which I'll show you. Getting out on the ground too, that's where we really start to understand the resources that are representative of Temple. So it may identify some areas where you might want to do some more detailed studies, particularly on your town lands. Now, that's really the basics behind what an NRI is and how your community comes into the fold of it. Now I'd like to introduce you to your resources through our lens. So basically the components of a natural resources, there's three main components. There's a series of maps. That's the pretty piece of an NRI, I think. And if we had all these maps printed up in this room, you'd probably all be centered around the room here staring at those and not even listening to me. And I wouldn't blame you one bit. So a variety of maps. There's within that, those maps, there's an awful lot of data. So we pull out some of this information for you. For those that like numbers, That's in there for you as well, along with the nice maps. We'll have photos in there to provide you with examples of what does a marsh look like, or what does a particular Appalachian oak pine forest look like? What does that mean? And then obviously the report, which is in draft phase right now, and we're finishing up. Those are the three main components. And now I'd like to start moving through some of these maps. I think there's a variety of 9 or 10 maps that we produced to help demonstrate the types of natural resources and their distribution in town. So you, as a landowner, you can look through these maps and see basically where you live. We don't have parcels on these maps, but see where you live and see how these natural resources occur on your property or maybe surrounding, or particularly some of the lands that you love to walk around on. So I just wanted to point out here, this is, I believe it's 2021 is this aerial photograph, so fairly recent. They just published some 2023. They're always updating maps, and it's what we have at our disposal. We always try to use the most up-to-date data, obviously. But in all of these maps, you'll see this, what we call base data. So you'll have your streams and your ponds and wetlands and roads all distributed throughout the town. So it kind of helps you to orient yourself in Temple, particularly if you're new here in town. So the streams here are these lines in blue. Here's your ponds, reservoirs, basically water supplies, Caswell Pond along town, Temple Brook. The wetlands are in this greenish coloration, a little bit hard to see here. This one stands out a little bit more. Those are our wetlands in your community. And then the green hatched areas are your conservation lands, to the best that we can determine that they are. There's always some holes in this data, some inaccuracies. We try to update them as much as possible. But as you can see, this whole edge right here, the Wapak range itself, most of it is protected federally. Some of it's private land that's protected as well throughout. But you have quite a bit of conservation lands distributed all throughout. Well, what does that mean? On those lands, what is actually protected? And of that that's protected, what is really high quality for that particular habitat? Those are some questions we have moving forward when we start to do some of these investigations. But what I love is just staring at an aerial photograph. You really get a good sense of what Temple looks like from the air as the crow flies, or whatever bird you want to be in any particular day flying over Temple. So you can see all the forest lands here with the wetlands mixed in. You can see your roadways and where development patterns are happening. Again, with your conservation lands as well. You can also start to distinguish between hardwood stands, meaning oaks and maples and birches and beeches here in these light colored areas all along the Wapak area, because there's some really interesting forest types that are up there. I've been studying this Wapak range for a little bit over 25 years at this point, before I even started Moosewood Ecological. You can also see a variety of softwood stands here that are really dominated by spruce and fir up in the highlands of the Wapak area, Miller State Park, Wapak Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. Lower down, you have more hemlock stands and areas that are mixed. So there's a lot of information that you can glean just by looking at an aerial photograph of your community. So basically, yes. There, we did find old trees, and I'm sure there are some patches of old growth here. Absolutely, particularly up on the Wapak area. There are some really hard to reach sites, and that doesn't mean they couldn't get there necessarily. It meant that was the last place that they wanted to get to, because how difficult it might have been during the 17 and 1800s. They still went into those areas and logged. It's amazing some of the areas that they went in by hand and logged with animals as well. I'll show a couple pictures of some old trees that we found. We didn't find an old growth forest per se. We found areas of very mature trees and remnants of old trees, like old oaks and old sugar maples, particularly on your town forest. That's a great question. And the more you walk throughout Temple, you're probably liable to find some of these. And they're not necessarily big trees. They don't have to be big to be old. Your black gums that are on the town forest, there's some old trees that are out there. They wouldn't be considered an old growth stand, but there are some old black gums that are well over a couple 100 years old, sugar maples as well. So when we're talking about resources in a community, we like to lump things together, sort of categorize or give themes. So one of our big themes is water resources. So we're talking about water above the ground as well as below the ground, things that we can't see like aquifers, and we'll get to that in a moment. But essentially, and the top part of this map is cut off, but you really see what the title is: wetlands and surface water resources. So that's what this map is showing. Again, that base data, which is a lot of it is water related. So you can see where all your streams are located throughout your community. Again, your reservoirs, water supply, ponds, wetlands, conservation lands. And then on top of this, we added what's called hydric soils, meaning that they're wetland-based soils. I say wetland-based soils because it doesn't necessarily mean it's a jurisdictional wetland in New Hampshire. It means that those soils promote the conditions to be hydric, which could be wetlands related. So in order to really get a well-rounded view of your wetlands, not only did the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 70s map all the wetlands in the United States, or to the best that they can. They missed a lot of small ones, forested ones, but this is pretty representative of Temple. But there's a variety of areas that they missed because the hydric soils didn't necessarily show that vegetation. So anyway, so we have your wetlands here in this dark greenish color, and then we have this orange coloration here, and then more of a maroon coloration. And those are your wetland soils. Very poorly drained soils are typically going to be wetland soils. Poorly drained soils, maybe so, maybe not. Russ Huntley could talk to this end much more eloquently than I could, being a wetland scientist. So these are your wetland and surface water resources in your community. As I said, we throw in some data for you, for those that like numbers. And this just gives you a sense of what's happening on your landscape besides just looking at a map. We're talking about the wetlands and classification types here. We have lacustrine wetlands. That's a fancy word for your lakes and ponds that you have in here. So there's roughly 157 acres, which account for the Greenville Reservoir, King Brook Reservoir, and Caswell Pond, all in the southeastern part of your community. Basically, where all the water flows to to the west. Excuse me. But of these wetlands, there's a variety of different types. So the majority of your wetlands in your community are just considered what's known as palustrine wetlands. That's your typical wetlands that you see driving down the road. Your marshes, emergent marsh, you have about 117 acres of those. Forested wetlands like the black gum swamps that you have in your community here, red maple swamps. You have hemlock swamps as well, a variety of these swamps that are dominated by trees. That's what we have here noted in forested wetlands, almost 180 acres. Shrub wetlands for those that love those blueberries and like to go pick wild blueberries. These are the areas you're looking for typically, are these shrub swamps, and they have a variety of other different types of shrubs associated with them. Withy rod, a lot of dogwoods, aquatic beds, lily ponds. You know, there's these unfamiliar terms, but I'll give you the familiar term too, the lily pond. And then unconsolidated bottom, beaver pond. That's where the beavers come in, dam up. What do they create? Open water situation. That's what unconsolidated bottom means. But these are all terms that were used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when they mapped these wetlands back in the 1970s, roughly around 1979. We give them technical terms, but it's good to have more familiar terms, the terms that we use on a regular basis. So comprising altogether, Temple has approximately 630 wetlands. There's probably a lot more than that, based on a lot of these smaller wetlands that don't show up. Some even smaller, such as little vernal pools that are considered as wetlands as well, don't show up in this data set. And we're talking about, that's about 5% of Temple, 630 acres. I believe you're about 22.3 square miles, which is about 14,300 acres is the size of your community. So not an awful lot, 5%. Some communities have less than that. Some have more. If you think about further to our west, Keene and Swansea down in the lowlands, the big floodplains of the Schwalett River Valley, also the Connecticut River Valley, those areas are going to have more wetlands because they're down lower in the landscape. A lot more water is going to collect in them. You sort of live in between those two worlds, in that you have your high elevations of the Wapak, where all that water comes off of those hills, flows into your town here, and then flows out. So almost all your water is contained within your community to a certain degree. There are some streams that come in from elsewhere, but that's a fortunate situation you're in that your headwaters are mostly protected. That's really important moving down the line for water quality. Next, in that water resources theme, are your groundwater resources. Now we're talking about aquifer systems that are beneath the ground that we can't necessarily see. You may have a well that's in a stratified drift aquifer. Most of us, like myself, I have a drilled well into a bedrock where they drill, they find a vein, it produces the water they need. They stop drilling and they said, "You're done, you got water." But some of these areas that are in the yellow here, these are your stratified drift aquifers, and obviously they're way down in the watershed associated with the Greenfield Reservoir as well, and then along Temple Brook. And you have them actually scattered throughout Temple, which kind of surprised me, the number of aquifer systems that you have in your community. Now, these are sands and gravels that were deposited when the glaciers receded out of this area. So very porous materials, often underlying your wetland systems and main stream systems and lakes and ponds. This is a reservoir, so it was dammed up. But you can see how these aquifers are flowing along your major stream systems, and look at the wetlands that are associated with that. So if you just isolate those particular areas, in which we haven't for this, but it would be interesting point to look at the number of wetlands that overlie your aquifer systems compared to the acreage of wetlands that occur elsewhere in your landscape. But you typically have surficial water that's associated with these sand and gravel deposits that hold groundwater. Why are these important? Because these may be future community water supplies for you moving into the future. For the state of New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services teamed up with the Forest Society to do an analysis looking at where communities might want to protect future community water supplies, meaning they did an analysis to take a look at known contamination sites throughout the state, looking at these large aquifer systems that have a lot of water in them, and say, these are some areas that you as a community may want to protect further down the line, 100, 200, 500 years, who knows, to protect this water resource down the future. Now, these are called favorable gravel well analysis. None really show up in Temple. That doesn't mean you don't have good water. It just means that you have a lot of probably a lot of good water here in your community that they didn't have to isolate. And there's probably not much information known about known contamination sources or potential contamination sources. There are in every community. Some are mapped. Think about the railroads that came up from Massachusetts through Troy up through Keene. There's a lot of places along there where a lot of chemicals were spilled. So those are some sites that DES was concerned about, thinking about future water resources. You don't have that issue here in Temple is my big point here. I don't know what the water quality is of these aquifer systems, but think you have, I think you're in a good position in your community, but you might want to think about aquifer protection into the future. And you do have some of protections afforded to you in your regulations through a review of that. So those are your water resources. Our next sort of theme, if you will, is really wildlife based or ecological based, looking at biodiversity and habitats. So what we have here is a bunch of different colored polygons in here. And these are all the different types of habitats over here on the left-hand side of the map in the legend for as a key so you can understand the variety of different resources in the community. So again, up in the western side of the area here, the Wapak Range, those are where you have some really interesting forest types that we don't normally have here in southern New Hampshire, being the northern hardwood conifer forest. It's because of elevational gain that you have here. So they're up high elevation. You move up further north, get north of Marlow into the foothills of the White Mountains. This orange coloration, that northern hardwood conifer forest is going to become much more prevalent. What you have an awful lot of is green space, and that being hemlock, hardwood, pine forest. That's your majority of your forest here. Roughly 60% of Temple is covered by that. And that's expected. That's basically the main forest ecosystem that we have in the southwest part of the state. But you have some really interesting forest types too, these Appalachian oak pine forest. These probably have some rare plants that are associated with them. Not that you wouldn't have these elsewhere, but these Appalachian oak pine forests aren't that common in New Hampshire. They're a little bit more common in the south central part of the state and the southeastern part of the state, where it's a little bit warmer and the soils are drier and more well drained and conducive to this type of forest. And these include a lot of trees and plants that are just a little bit further to the south of us. And that's why we don't have a lot of these forests here. Not yet. Give it 50, 100 years. I think we're going to have a few more. But not only does this show those upland forest communities, but then you can see in here in this gray coloration surrounded by the red, these are really interesting habitat types that are not very common in most communities until you get up into the White Mountains. These are really rocky based habitats. So rock balds, cliffs, white ledges. Talus slopes, you have these along the Wapak Range as well. So those are some very interesting, distinct wildlife habitats that also have very, very interesting plant communities that you wouldn't have elsewhere here in Temple. So these are the special, really special pieces of Temple that are dotted in these smaller habitat types. Another really significant habitat type that is dwindling, and it may sound weird, but are your grasslands. You know, back in the early 1800s, around the sheep craze, around 1810, our landscape was becoming opened an awful lot more than it was in 1768 when Temple was founded. It's part of your password for your Wi-Fi here, by the way. So a lot has changed since 1968. Yes, 1768, excuse me. Probably around from 1810 to 1840. That was the height of the sheep craze, roughly during that 30-year period. There was a lot of your higher lands around here, the marginal lands, if you will, became really important during that time because there was a lot of money to be made with raising sheep at that particular time. It was a boom, then it was a bust. You know why it was a bust? Because all of a sudden you can get out to Ohio and cotton you could grow for pennies on the dollar, where keeping sheep alive cost an awful lot more. So it became, it was not economical anymore. A lot of people started leaving farms at that particular point, heading to cities for factories. A little bit later, Civil War came. People were heading out to the fertile lands where you don't have as many rocks out in the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River Valley. You know, there's transportation out there. We could get cotton for goods, for our linens, for our clothes at that particular point. So around the early to mid 1800s is probably the height of the most clearing. Now, At that point, it was probably about 80% open. And that's the general idea of most all of New Hampshire, particularly the southern half. Now it's flipped. Absolutely. It's about 80% forested. And that's why all these little areas in the orange coloration here with a little grass symbol, those are noting your grasslands. So these are either maintained just by mowing. They could be hay fields. They could be pastures. Some of them could be maybe row crops, could be cornfields potentially. That's sort of one of those errors that's in this data. But you can see how they're distributed throughout. But why is that important? Is because a lot of those animals that are associated with that, they went through a boom in the 1800s too, especially right when farms were being abandoned, because then there was less people there. So these species that are associated with shrubland habitat and grassland habitats, there's a variety of birds like bobolinks and meadowlarks. There's a variety of reptiles that may use these areas as well for nesting, turtle nesting sites. Wood turtles use these areas. Other types of turtles in your community will use these areas for nesting. Smooth green snakes, which are a species of concern, which are actually here in Temple, use these particular areas. So these grasslands are dwindling in size. So that means that habitat is not as common. And so there's a lot of species of conservation concern that are associated with these areas. And then we talked about a lot of the wetlands, but this breaks it down into some other different types of wetland types. So guess what? More data. So I won't go through all this, but I already mentioned 60% is your is your hemlock hardwood pine forest. Add that to the area of your northern hardwood conifer forest. That's about 75% of your community there. And then you can start to see all these other types of wildlife habitats that there's very little of in your community. So one of the things that we created for the Conservation Commission and the community here is the Temple, New Hampshire Biodiversity Project. I won't go into a whole lot of detail for saving time this evening, but it is a page that we set up through the iNaturalist project, which is an international community science oriented project that has really just taken off big time. We use it a lot. We use it in communities we work in. We hold bio blitzes as a way of getting communities to come out to help list the biodiversity within towns. So we created this page. So all the observations that go through this iNaturalist program end up getting populated here in Temple on this page specifically for you. So you can keep an eye on this site. And this I just downloaded today. So this is pretty up to date. I bet somebody probably made some observations and added it to it. But so far, there have been 760 different species that have been identified here in Temple. That's the tip of the iceberg, folks. You have thousands of species and thousands of species here in Temple. And this includes not just your birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians, but insects as well, mushrooms, lichens, molds. It gets crazy, the stuff that you can post on iNaturalist. And of that, there's been 128 observers. Now, the iNaturalist project utilizes an iNaturalist app that you can put on your phone, your smartphone. It's real easy to use. If you're interested in learning about it, you can go to the iNaturalist site. They have tutorials on there. Basically, you take a picture of something and then you download it. Then it'll go into a database and a professional will help you identify it unless it's easily recognized, like an oak leaf. That'll come up and then they'll tell you immediately, that's an oak leaf, a red oak maybe. But there's certain things like moths and beetles and a variety of other things that aren't as easy to identify. And there's professionals out there that in their spare time, they verify these. Isn't that pretty cool? One of them is our very own Stephen Lamont, who is our project manager and ecologist. He is one of the verifiers, so we know it's good data. because he was out on your landscape out here too, just like I was and a few other members of our team. Anyway, I encourage you to check this out. Here is the web address, inaturalist.org projects/temple-biodiversity-project. And that'll bring you right to there. And then again, if you download the app, start using it, it'll populate on Temple's site. And it'll look sort of like this. All of these are hits all throughout your community. Look at there, a Wapak trail, right? No wonder there's so many along there. People are walking that trail all the time. But then there's a lot of different areas. Everybody knows what's up here, your town forest, right? There's a lot of observations in your town forest as well. The Hill Track owned by the Forest Society, right? They have the easement on it anyway. That was one of the sites that we actually did visit, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But this shows you all the different sites where an observation was made, and the color is associated with the taxonomic group, if you will, or the group of animals. I don't know the colors off the top of my head, but one color would be for birds, one color would be for amphibians, and so forth. And this is an example of what you can do. You can query through here to learn more about plants. And that's what I did. I just selected the plant button. And so there's a variety of different images that pop up. Some of these are the ones that the individual took. And if it's not of a clear quality, sometimes they'll just put a stock picture in. But you have things such as red maple, American beech, mountain laurel. You got a lot of mountain laurel around here, which is really neat. And last year, it must have been really spectacular here in town. Last year was one of the best blooms that I've seen, mountain laurel. So I'm really hoping for that again. But then you also have invasive plants, which you may know as well, Oriental bittersweet. You have the whole cast of characters here basically scattered throughout, but you're lucky you don't have a lot of them. Then you can also take a look at all the amphibians in your community, as well as I mentioned mushrooms, fungus. So it's a really fun site to play around on and to get involved with. It's a lot of fun for people of all ages. Kids get into it, adults get into it. It's a lot of fun, especially if you do it as a big activity in the town, maybe have an event for it. Chaga. So when we start to work on natural resource inventory for a community, there's a variety of information that we know where to go and find that's existing. So we want to know all we can before we even start to get it out on the ground or start to get into the mapping process. So one of our go-tos is the New Hampshire Natural Heritage Bureau, because they maintain the list of rare plants and animals and the significant natural communities on our landscape. As you can see, there's a big hole here in Temple. What they know is that there are, I mentioned the smooth green snake and wood turtles here in your community, but we've identified other rare species that are in your community as well that have not been populated on this list that will become so. So that's really what the natural heritage says you have. But you can see from that list of species, there's a lot of wildlife, a lot of plant life, and a lot of other organisms out on the landscape. So as I mentioned, the first year was all about those maps, and I'll show you a couple more as we sort of wind down with the presentation here. But this past year, we got on the ground to take a look at your biodiversity. So we're adding our list to that list on the iNaturalist site, which most of our stuff has been populated on there, except for sensitive species we didn't put on that site. So we visited a variety of different areas in the community. Mostly were public property, so like the Wapak Range, that's federal and state, and private lands, as well as town-owned lands, the Temple Town Forest, which is examples of where these photographs came from. Kendall Ledge or White Ledges, mentioned the Hill Track, and a couple private properties we had permission from that landowner to visit those areas. So we got out to the places we could. We also did some roadside observations as well as we're driving around and see a red-tailed hawk landing somewhere. We stop and record that information. And so for the Templetown Forest is really quite a gem. That's a really neat area. If you haven't been there, you should take a walk and enjoy that area. We have wood frogs that are out there using these vernal pools, which you have several of those. You have black gum swamps, which are not really rare, but they're not really common around here. And they're getting towards the northern end of their range. Further south, you see a lot more of them, but they can get up to 800 years old. Yeah, and they're not really that big. Places I've worked, we'd find them 3.5 feet in diameter, and those trees are 500 years old. It's pretty amazing to be in the midst of something like that, and when these trees aren't giant like you think of old growth trees should be. And so here are your black gum trees right here. This one was actually cut. This is right next to a trail. That's why there's two stems here, is cut at one particular point. But one thing that's really fascinating is your American chestnut that's out on this property. And I wonder how many more are surrounding this area. This is sprouting your chestnut here. You have viable chestnuts in this community that are reproducing. That's amazing, folks. Templetown Forest is a true gem for the black gum swamps, the vernal pools, the sweetness in the soils, meaning that there's a lot of sugar maple, a lot of ash that was out there, and the people that built the homestead over there, because you can see the foundation, they knew what they were doing. They knew how to read plants, and I'm pretty sure they realized that this was an enriched area. So they did a lot of farming, meaning producing food, not only pastures for their livestock, but was producing food right on this site. We found a variety of different interesting species out here, but your American chestnut is by far one of the most magnificent pieces of that property, I would say. That's not all the great gems that you have here in Temple. This is that wetland system associated with the hill track and the reservoir. And so this is what, if you look at that table, it said emergent marsh. That's what we're looking at here, or a marsh, what you call it, where you see ducks swimming around, maybe a great blue heron fishing. And out here, that's your lily pads. That's that aquatic bed, just a difference in terms, right? I was talking about mountain laurel. This is a really neat Appalachian oak mountain laurel forest. Not real common in New Hampshire. You have quite a bit here. Mason has quite a bit. This whole area has some really extensive stands of this really neat forest type. Talking about old trees, this is several hundred years old. This is an oak tree up on the side of the Wapak Range. I didn't take this picture. Stephen was up there, so he could tell you the exact location. But this is a really interesting forest type that's not real common around the area. And it has this really old remnant red oak tree that's associated with it. And I'm sure there's several more of those. There's a really nice sugar maple that's hollowing out on your Templetown Forest. It's right next to a trail that's really, really nice. And you can see it has low limbs on it because it grew in the open. Same thing as this oak here. This area was all open. You can see how young this forest is surrounding here. And then this fairly short statured red oak, because it was growing in the open, it didn't have to grow tall. And here's another, this is up on White Ledges, the Kindle Ledges here. This is a rocky, red oak rocky woods forest here too. Really unique for Temple. And you never know who's watching you out in the woods, do you? So this is just the tip of the iceberg of your biodiversity here. Really quickly, unfragmented lands was mapped here, and these are areas that are basically roadless in your community. So the darker the coloration, meaning the larger that roadless area is. And they're really important for a variety of different species. We know that bear are going to cruise all over the place. They're going to come to your backyard, investigate your chicken coop and your bird feeder, but then they're also going to go to those shrub swamps that we were talking about to eat the berries that are out there. And then they go to that black gum swamp and feed out there. So they're cruising all around. They kind of don't mind us in a way. They don't want anything to do with us necessarily, but we offer them some treats from time to time. Maybe not on purpose though. But then we have things like little ovenbirds and other small birds that need these large intact forests. And so now you can see here a little bit better compared to the aerial map of where your development patterns are and how has that broken up the forested landscape. So you can see where these big areas of forest are, these medium patches of forest that are really significant, and some of the smaller forested areas in your community. Moving into the what I call the working landscape, agricultural soils and forest soils. That's where we got into these two realms. So what this map identifies is a variety of soil types that are basically good for farming the way that they are. The areas in really dark, these are all prime farmland soils, suggesting that they're some of the best soils for food, feed, and fiber for farming. And then these other areas in yellow and orange are farmlands of other significance in your community. You can see there's a lot in Temple that has good growing potential. Roughly 40% of your community is identified as having some type of good agricultural soils. And that doesn't mean if you've been farming these areas for decades and you've been a good steward of the land and building up those soils that you don't have good soils if your property is noted, say in white here, say maybe you live over here. This is just saying what the Natural Resource Conservation Service says. These are some good soils. You probably have some good soils in your own garden as well. So we look at it from a flip side of it and look at where the good soils for forest. Everywhere, right? So all these areas in green right here are some of the best soils to promote hardwood growth, where you'd want to grow things like oak and maples and ashes while they're still here. The areas in orange, you notice these are small and they're associated with your stream systems here. These are really good for growing white pine, meaning those are areas that can grow some really high quality white pine without a lot of input. And same goes with the green area. Those are really good for growing hardwoods without input. And this is one way of managing a property, and it's how the state of New Hampshire typically manages their lands, are based on soil types. So this gives you a sense of your forest soils. And then on all these maps, we've been showing the conservation lands. This kind of breaks it down to the type of conservation lands. Conservation easements are some of the most widely used forms of conservation these days, working with places like Audubon or Forest Society, or maybe the Monadnock Conservancy. These are the areas in green. These fee-owned lands just mean they're owned straight out by, these are federal lands. Here's your Temple Town Forest. So these are owned by the town. And then there's this area, these flowage rights or some sort of other easement that they're identified. And roughly you have about 24% of Temple that says through our data is protected in some form or another. Those fee-owned lands, they may or may not have formal protection on them. They're owned by the town. They're used as conservation lands, but there may not be formal protection. So that distinction should be noted. All right, as we round out here, some basic recommendations that have come out of this. This is our second attempt at recommendations because of the other work that we've been doing with the planning board, is looking at your regulatory documents. How does that stack up with your master plan? And that was one of the original recommendations we had in the draft plan. So the town has already moved forward with trying to understand how does your current regulations afford protections for natural resources. So that's what we're investigating right now. And I think Sean had alluded to that. But some quick points here. Obviously, this will be incorporated into your new master plan since the last NRI was 2008, 2003, 2008, I believe. So other next steps that you'd want to move towards is looking at conservation focus areas based on a lot of this data that we use and incorporating some other information, and then to develop that open space plan, which looks at these particular areas in terms of their high priorities for natural resources protection based on the data that we've been looking at. That would be a next step. Always community outreach and landowner outreach, and continuing to working with adjacent communities on conservation efforts, because you may have some projects that straddle the Temple line with another community, and that community may have that area in mind too. They're working with willing landowners for conservation. And finally, as we round out here as well, this map is in the, will be in the report. It's an inset map. But this sort of starts getting towards that open space plan from a state level. The Fish and Game worked with a lot of partners and developed the Wildlife Action Plan back in 2005. And that's where that data came from for the wildlife habitats. They update it periodically, and it's going through an update right now for 2025. They update the plan every 10 years. That habitat data is updated every 5 years. But also what they do, they take a lot of this information and they develop these sort of highest ranked habitats in the state. And these purple areas, based on their analysis, are some of the highest valued areas in terms of their habitat types. Green areas are the next highest ranked areas in the state. And then this sort of yellowish orange kind of coloration is what's called surrounding landscapes. It helps to protect these other areas. Yes. Right. I mean, ecological value based on the biodiversity. Yeah, and the quality of the habitats. In the beginning, I was talking about conservation land. So what are on these lands? Is it of high quality? And this is one way of determining or coming to that conclusion. Also through our site assessments help identify quality too. So that's what I mean by high value, meaning that they're represented, they're great habitats that are representative for New Hampshire and your community. So this is one tool your community can look at when you're thinking about working with willing landowners, putting land into conservation. Next steps, there's not a whole lot left. I need to finish up your report. And as we round out this natural resources protection audit, we'll include some of this information into the NRI, as well as the chapter on last year's site visits as well. So we're pretty close to being done. So that should be wrapped up hopefully within the next few weeks. Here. And with that, we'll let Mrs. Wood Turtle here ask, do you have any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. That's what we use. Yep. Yeah, you guys are actually welcome to this data. There's not much that we created. This project really looked at using existing data. So all this stuff is available. Trying to think if we did, we might have manipulated some of the wetlands a little bit to make them a little bit more representative, but we'd be happy to share this data with you. Absolutely. That's one thing that we do. We provide this data. There's no need for us to just hold on to it. We may use it from a more regional perspective, but it's your data. It's your NRI. That's how we see it. Yes, sir. All this data Nope, they're not on our webpage. The draft report is actually on your town website. Yep, yeah, it's basically the full thing here. It doesn't include the section from our field visits from last year, as well as a little bit of synopsis on the natural resource protection audit.
Second question, not quite subject matter. You're all stomping around in the woods. If you're up on Kidder Mountain, my father saw it, and Ben Golden, who just lost, saw it. There is a fish hard in the ground.
Oh, really?
Anybody sees that, I want to see it.
Up on, oh,
Fish is hard.
huh,
Now, I live on Fish Road, and it used to be the old fish place, family that lived where I am was named Fish. It might be modern, might not.
Huh.
Very curious of what it is. The top of Kidder Mountain is sort of unusual, as in a lightning strike burned the top of the mountain.
yeah.
Like Mount Nana, artificial there's stone,
Mhm.
but maybe not. You know, going back how far you go.
Yeah,
Like I say, anybody sees this thing, let me know. Put it on the top of what they-
it's definitely on my list. I'll keep a lookout for it. But fires are really common up on our mountaintops around here from lightning. In fact, that's how some of those forests up on these ridges are maintained by fire. If fire was absent, those forests would change into different forest types.
Big fire on top of Kidder Mountain.
Yeah. Hmm, okay.
And Monadnock, they fire someone to try and get really good.
Yeah.
They didn't.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Um, yeah, I think that I think we have a chore ahead of us in identifying, as a landowner, for you to identify where these ash trees are, which ones are females, and give them a little girth, meaning maybe provide a little bit more sun around them so those seeds can then germinate. White ash needs a little bit of light to germinate. So if we can perpetuate the species, maybe we can get a handle on the bug, the emerald ash borer, maybe not. It could be worth an effort. It'd have to be a big, large effort between a lot of landowners. But as a landowner, that's the optimistic side. Find the ash trees and watch them as they become infected, and then try to take care of them. I have seen areas where the ashes have been eliminated. Black ash swamps are not common in our area. There's a site in Chester where we've been working, and they're sprouting from the base, so they haven't died yet, but the upper parts have. So those individuals are still alive, so we can just do what we can. Ash trees. Maybe. Maybe. Yeah, yeah, they do. They do. Ash are their preferred resource, definitely. But it's something to watch out for, and to watch how our forests change. You know, the American chestnut, again, within 30 years of its time, it was almost nearly completely eliminated from the east, you know, and we're talking about in the heart of its range, it was 15 to 30 feet in diameter and 200 feet tall down in the Smoky Mountains. If you've ever seen any of those that may still be standing and dead, or that have fallen, because they take a long time to rot. In fact, some of your older homes around here, some of the sill work may be chestnut or white oak, because those are very rot resistant woods. So yeah, sure.
From what you've seen, do you have a list, or could you tabulate a list of the invasive plants? I know that I'm familiar with many of the more common ones, but I find that sometimes I learn something I thought was native or at least not invasive actually is. And it might be something the Concom could help educate the community, because we don't want people accidentally encouraging invasive. Anything like, is that a possibility? Have a list of invasive that you've seen in town?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have two comments to that. One is, this is where your iNaturalist comes in. You can do a query and find out where those invasives were. So then you can see the distribution throughout your town. In our chapter for our site visits, we list the species that we saw on the properties where we saw them. And keep in mind, we didn't comb these properties from end to end, but we certainly noted where these are. And they're really in your typical spaces along the roadsides, along the edges of your wetlands and ponds and what have you. But yes, those will be in the report. There's actually a little section in there under invasives that we need to update based on last year's stuff. But yeah, that's what that iNaturalist is about. So if you do decide to download that app and use it, and you're finding some of these, maybe you don't even know that it's actually an invasive, and then you learn about it. And then now you're sharing that resource with everybody else that taps into this page that we developed for you guys. The other thing is that I promote wholeheartedly, and this is another thing of what we do to promote biodiversity on smaller scales with all landowners: plant native plants to the degree that you can. We know that there's more non-native plants that are available at nurseries. That's just how it is. There's more places coming online that are selling native plants. There's a lot of trees and shrubs that you can get, but now there's a lot of herbaceous plants like wildflowers and other things that are available. So when you can, plant native. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thanks, everybody. If anybody has follow-up questions, you can contact the Concom. We have an email, templeconcom@gmail.com, or you could just contact the town and they'll get questions or comments to us. Thank you.